My name is Bill Shambra, Director of Hudson Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. And Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled, What is Social Justice Philanthropy? Good afternoon and happy Groundhog Day. My name is Bill Shambra.
That was usual, Bill.
I know. Those of you who know what that's all about will have to explain to the people next to you who have no idea. Anyway, before we get underway, our customary preview of coming attractions, please mark your calendars for February 16th. That's in 2 weeks, so we have a pretty short turnaround here. For our next panel, which will discuss the question, are think tanks becoming too political? Our conversation that day will take its bearings from an essay published by Hudson scholar Tevi Troy in the latest National Affairs magazine, in which he argues basically that they are becoming too political. I think you'll find that the usual ideological categories will be hopelessly scrambled in the responses from our panelists, which will include Neera Tandon of the Center for American Progress, Will Marshall, the Progressive Policy Institute, and Michael Frank of Heritage Action and the Heritage Foundation. Chris DeMuth, who just joined Hudson after many years as president of AEI, will be the moderator of that panel. Now, for today's panel, it would be difficult to improve on Albert Ruesga's fanciful description of what social philanthropists do, playing off the old adage that charity gives a person a fish while philanthropy teaches a person to fish. As he put it, social justice grant makers aim to go one step beyond teaching a man to fish. To borrow an old saying, they ask why so few people in this man's community can afford to own a fishing pole, why the county incinerator is being sited in his neighborhood, befouling his pond, rather than that of his wealthier townsmen, and why he's being taught to fish when he's more likely to earn a living wage as an accountant or an engineer, end quote. Actually, Albert, today's foundations would first insist that you construct a logic model connecting the consumption of fish to the improvement of health, explaining how the fish catching will be sustained after the grant ends, and promised to form a fishing collaborative that would include all the stakeholders, including the fish. Anyway, to tackle this question, what is social justice philanthropy? We have a knowledgeable and skilled panel with us today. We'll hear first from Dr. Ruesga, who's currently president and CEO of the Greater New Orleans Foundation and one of the finest bloggers on philanthropy, White Courtesy Telephone. If you're not familiar with that blog, you should be. It's invariably enlightening and informing, even when I myself am the target thereof, which happens occasionally. Next, we'll hear from Peter Frumkin, who's the director of the RGK Center for Philanthropy and Community Service at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, University of Texas at Austin. Next up will be Thomasina Williams, until recently a program officer at the Ford Foundation, and now director of the Sankofa Legacy Fund. And finally, Christine Doby, a program officer at the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. So, Albert.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Kristen, for helping to get us all here today. And as one of my uncles used to say when he first came to the United States from Cuba and was learning English, I am very exciting to be here. Special thanks goes, of course, to the Hudson Institute, which is hosting us today, even after all the things I've said about it. And thank you all very much for coming out today to reflect on social justice philanthropy. By way of preface to my remarks, which I assure you will constitute the crowning experiences of your lunch hours, if not your lives, I wanted to say a few brief words about the paper that I co-authored with Deborah Punteny, very grandly titled Social Justice Philanthropy, and the initial framework for positioning this work. This is the paper that Bill recommended for your edification. It's available from a link from the Bradley Center site. and it goes especially well, I'm told, with a Shiraz. The paper was commissioned by an entity called the Working Group on Philanthropy for Social Justice and Peace, which had its roots, like so many other nefarious, unspeakable, liberal things, at the Ford Foundation. And yes, we know that Susan Bareford has a lot to answer for. Christopher Harris, who was then a senior program officer at Ford, brought together a group of smart, big-hearted people and me so that we could grouse about liberal philanthropy as usual, but also hopefully do something about it. We were united then, as we are now, by two things. One was a very wide-ranging critique of mainstream liberal philanthropy, a critique that took aim at its assumptions, its analyses, its strategies or lack thereof, its methods, its fashion sense, the whole bowl of popcorn. The second thing that united us was a vision of the way that liberal philanthropy could be practiced, or should be practiced, in order to make a real and a lasting impact in the lives of poor people and other marginalized groups. And now I have a confession to make. We struggled mightily initially to define what social justice philanthropy is, and it was because a number of us got fed up with that discussion that we decided to write the article that I mentioned earlier. And so you see, one of the purposes of the paper was to get people to stop arguing about the definition of social justice philanthropy. And here we have an entire panel dedicated to arguing about this. And this shows, if anything, that there is a kind of justice in the world, even if there might not be much social justice. The paper essentially argues that philanthropy for social justice and peace is not one thing, but it's a whole family of approaches, a whole family of grant-making traditions. And we identified 8 such traditions in the paper. There were many more that we included, but quite frankly, we wanted to spare the reader, preserve the sanity of our readers. I'm a huge fan of John Rawls, for example, but nowhere in this paper will you find any mention of the social contract tradition. Many social justice grant makers, but certainly not all, focus on helping the least well-off in society. And I'm informed by one of my colleagues, Kwasi Aidu, who's the director of Trust Africa, that merchants of Arab descent suffer terrible discrimination in Senegal. They are by no means the least well-off in Senegalese society, but their cause is rightly the concern of grant makers who care about social justice. Many of these grant makers, but again, not all, attempt to change the political, economic, and social structures that drive whole communities or whole classes of people into poverty or into second-class citizenship and keep them there. Some focus exclusively on empowering individuals politically, giving them political power so that they have the means to vote their oppressors out of office. Still others believe that market forces can most effectively eliminate the causes of social disparities. And some, because I know my colleague Bill Shambra will try to raise this point, they don't really give a flea's nipple about the root causes of our social ills. For them, philanthropy for social justice is not the same as Bill's benighted root causes of philanthropy, which he's been attempting to stamp out for the past 90 years. Has it been 90 years, Bill? At least it's felt that way. But these grant makers argue that you don't have to dig around too much to find the causes of many injustices because they're in plain sight, so you don't have to dig for the roots of these injustices. Far more interesting for me than the question, what is social justice philanthropy, in my view anyway, is how do you do it well? And also, what is its significance? And I wanted to give just a few a few examples of what a significance might be. I'm going to leave the question of how you do it well to our discussion this afternoon, if anybody wants to raise that issue. But I will say this about its meaning and its significance. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of practitioners across the world who self-identify as social justice grant makers or social justice philanthropists. And it constitutes, I would argue, one of the largest schools of thought in contemporary philanthropy. There is often in much of social justice philanthropy an implied critique of liberal philanthropy as usual. And the image that always comes to mind for me is that you have a group of grant makers standing by a river, and they're pulling drowned, injured, half-dead bodies out of the water. They're bandaging some, and they're burying others, but they're never stopping to think, to wander upstream, to ask where are these bodies coming from and why are they coming? And I think that daring to ask that question, where are the bodies coming from and why, is really the essence of social justice philanthropy. Championing what I've called social justice philanthropy, by the way, implies no critique of charity. It implies no critique of checkbook philanthropy. It does imply, in my view, that if you're trying to end poverty or reform public education or provide affordable housing, then you would be a fool, frankly, not to attend to the social justice dimensions of the issue that you're trying to address. And in this way, philanthropy for social justice is intimately connected with current discussions or current debates, ongoing discussions in the field about measurable impact and strategic giving. For a very wide range of social issues, and not all, but for a very wide range of social issues, the effectiveness of the grant maker is profoundly compromised if he fails to consider such things as the effects of racism and sexism, if he fails to consider the manner in which power and privilege are held and brokered in a given society, if he fails to consider the structural arrangements that benefit one caste at the expense of another, and a host of other factors that are really the domain of the social justice grant maker. And lest I be accused of trying to kind of skirt the question that brought us here today, what is social justice philanthropy? I have to confess that I have a dog in that particular fight. I quiver like a bowl of lime jello when I think about the shared values tradition of social justice philanthropy, which is one of the 8 traditions that we outline in the paper. This tradition asserts that social justice can be most effectively promoted by appealing to universal or near universal values. Martin Luther King Jr. had a special genius for reminding us of the values that we share, values like liberty and fairness. Our sense of fairness is especially powerful. There's a long line of thinkers, and I would include John Rawls among them, by the way, stretching back thousands of years, who identify justice with fairness. They say that really justice is nothing more than fairness. And what's most interesting to me about our sense of fairness is that it doesn't appear to be confined to the human species. That's one of the extraordinary things about it. In 2003, I don't know how many of you caught this in the news, a group of researchers taught a group of capuchin monkeys to exchange tokens for food. And usually when these monkeys swapped the token, they got a piece of cucumber in return. But if one of these capuchins saw another monkey get a grape, which is a much more desired food amongst capuchin monkeys, then all hell would break loose, right? The offended monkey would fling poo. The offended monkey would claim that there was liberal bias. In some cases that they would become sullen and uncooperative. And the scientists who conducted this experiment suggested that capuchins might share to some degree our sense of fairness. And we know from our own experiences that a sense of fairness crosses party lines and international borders. In our country, There's wide, although of course not universal agreement, but there's wide agreement that there should be no public laws, policies, or procedures that overtly or inadvertently discriminate against women, against racially defined groups, against groups defined by religion and others to diminish their life chances. And put another way, many of us believe, again, though not all, that there should be a level playing field. And appealing to this level playing field is really a kind of appeal to a sense of fairness or justice. There is, as many of you know, however, that there's strong evidence that the playing field has not been level for all, and that this unlevel playing field has compromised our social capital, has compromised our human capital. And the evidence for this comes, I would say, in three forms, probably more. First, there is the fact that there are, in fact, laws, policies, and procedures that discriminate and that affect whole classes of individuals. For example, there's discrimination against gay and lesbian people in employment, housing, and other domains that's still legal in many states. And there are many examples of legal discrimination affecting other groups, including zero tolerance policies, disciplinary policies in public schools, and laws that make it difficult for ex-offenders to find jobs and reintegrate into society once they've paid their dues. Second, there's overwhelming evidence that racism and other forms of bigotry continue to affect the life chances of whole classes of people. This evidence comes not only from the lived experience of individuals who suffer sometimes daily assaults on their dignity, but also from empirical research that continues to document the effects of explicit or unconscious bigotry. Decades of matched pair testing, and you know these kinds of tests where you have an individual who's a person of color and a person who's white, who are taught to present in the same way, who are present exactly the same credentials and exactly the same resumes, and you'll find again and again that typically the person of color gets the shaft, isn't called back for a second interview. These and other studies have provided strong evidence of racial bias in the workplace and housing and in many other domains. And finally, and just focusing on race for the moment, the disparities in health, housing, education, employment, and other outcomes between Black Americans and white Americans appear too great and too persistent to be explained solely as the historical artifacts of slavery and Jim Crow. And to just take a peek inside of what's inside of the Chamber of Horrors, 69% of Black children can't read at grade level in the 4th grade. This is compared to 29% of white children, which is itself a barbarous thing. 1.5 million Black men out of a total voting population of 10.4 million have lost their right to vote because of felony convictions. 1 in 3 Black men between the ages of 20 and 29 is under correctional supervision or control. Close to half of all Black children in the United States live below the federal poverty line, and that's a bar that's embarrassingly low. The net worth of Black families is $6,100. The net worth of white families is $67,000. And even if we agree about the causes of these disparities, we can agree that these disparities hurt us all and require a special effort to address them. They undermine the human and social capital that we need to advance economically. They can lead to social unrest and worse, and just they're basically unjust. So there we have it. We have, at least in my view, justice as fairness. You have social justice philanthropy as an alternative to what I sometimes call philanthropy in bad faith. Social justice philanthropy as a challenge to those who, for example, want to reform public education, but haven't the slightest clue why, at one point in our history, our public schools started falling down around the ears of our Black children. And I realize that this is a tough sell. I'm reminded of the Italian proverb that everybody loves justice for the other person, right, in the affairs of another. But I'm also inspired by Matt Groening's observation that while the courts may not be doing their jobs terribly well, as long as everyone is videotaping everyone else, there's still a chance that justice will be done. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Bill, for assembling another interesting panel. I hope we can have a good conversation about the question of what is social justice philanthropy. I'm something of a literalist, and so when I was invited to appear here, I was given a paper. I read the paper, and I think my job as pedant and the resident academic is to focus on the paper and to raise some questions for the author of the paper. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, because we don't have it kind of summarized quite fully, you gave a fabulous kind of framing of what is social justice philanthropy. I want to drill down a little bit what's in the paper, because in the paper there are 8 visions of social justice philanthropy that are presented, and they're essentially presented as 8 ways of seeing this domain. If you're a philanthropist, how would you kind of conceptualize this question of social justice philanthropy? One is this idea of structural injustice. Second is human rights. Third is redistribution. Fourth is rule of law. Fifth is empowerment. Sixth is shared values. 7 is cultural relativism. And 8 is this triple bottom line. And then the paper does a really nice job, and I really applaud it and encourage you to take a look at it. It drills down each of these 8 visions of social justice philanthropy. I think the paper calls them traditions, or a family of traditions, and lays out examples and kind of walks you through these 8 different paradigms of social justice philanthropy. Now, as I read the paper, I actually thought that this is not really just a typology, a kind of simple little descriptive exercise. I thought there's something more going on here. That in essence what the paper does is it tries to lay out what I think are 8 theories of change, 8 ways in which social justice donors could go about trying to transform and change society. Each of these 8 different ways, from structural injustice to rule of law to shared values to triple bottom line and the others, constitutes a model, a way in which philanthropy could, in fact, change social order. Now, the question I have as I read this paper and kept coming back to me, kind of fall into 3 categories. One is a set of practical questions, and I'm going to pose them, and maybe if some of them interest us, we can explore them. Second are strategic questions, and the last are kind of philosophical. So the practical questions are, as you read these 8 different competing visions of what is social justice philanthropy and how it might be pursued, what exactly is the relationship between these different visions, these different models, these different what I call theories of change? Are they nested in some way? Are they connected to one another? Do they complement each other? Or do they compete with one another? How do we understand how this field is coherent? We don't get an answer. We get these 8 well-constructed visions of social justice philanthropy, but we're not told, from a practical point of view, how we are to use them if one were a funder or someone interested in philanthropy. So that's the first question I have is, well, what is really going on here in terms of the exercise? Is it purely just a descriptive historical exercise, or is it more a normative exercise? I think it's a normative exercise, but it hasn't come out, frankly, and said, these are 8 different models, and here's how they work, and here's when they work. And I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to know exactly what is going on in terms of the normative content and not simply kind of a descriptive claim about social justice philanthropy. I tend to think some of these 8 theories or models are in tension with one another. The idea of addressing structural injustice or pursuing redistribution is fundamentally different from the other idea of empowerment, which basically says we're going to give people the tools to transform themselves as opposed to working on changing the system in which they operate. So how do we understand it? Whose job is it to transform the world? Some of these theories say it's macro, huge structural work that has to be done. Others basically focus on values and empowerment at individual level concern. So what's going on? I think these are in somewhat of a tension at least at some level. So I'd like to understand more about what is the underlying theory there. Then the second practical question I have is one about how would you actually go about using these different 8 models, these 8 theories. What would be the decision rule if one were a funder? And we have 3 funders here, so why not ask? What is the decision rule for deciding which of these approaches to social justice, assuming you want to pursue social justice, what's the decision rule for knowing which one to use? When do I take an empowerment strategy? When do I take a triple bottom line approach? When do I focus on redistribution? What is my decision rule here? We don't have guidance. We have a frame, a typology, but no concrete guidance. And that just raises a set of other kind of related practical questions, which is, who is the real audience for this paper? That's the real one. Is the audience for this paper people who are already pre-committed to social justice philanthropy, and then we are now giving them a little handbook to work with? Is it for opening up other people's minds about this question of what is social justice philanthropy? That needs to be more explicit, along with this question of normative versus descriptive in terms of what the work is actually trying to do. So I think it's a nice job. I think it's one of the few papers you actually can read where you can follow it. There are 8 nice ideas in here. They're laid out sequentially. But we just need, after we do all that groundwork, we need to stand back and ask, so what? How do I use this? What is the issue of how do we resolve this issue of tension or a competition between these theories? How do we know when to use them? We need to work that out in volume 2, I would suggest. But then I have a second, those are practical considerations. I have some more kind of strategic concerns. At some level, the paper wants to argue that philanthropy, now I'm subtle, but it wants to argue that philanthropy should try to think about social justice. Why go through all this work unless one believes that this is something that the field should try to do? You're not, I can't imagine you're preaching to the alternative funds and the small number of social justice funders out there. I gotta believe you want other funders, bigger funders, to look at this and consider this model as one that they might use. But the question I have is, would this really work? Would getting mainstream funders, individual institutional funders, turned on to social justice philanthropy, would that actually promote social change? I have my doubts. There was a book written 40 years ago, published actually by University Press, Indiana, published it, called Philanthropy and Cultural Imperialism. In that book, Robert Arnove argues that in fact foundations and big donors are the enemies of social justice. And he argues in fact that big foundations are cooling off agencies, places where social movements, change efforts are in fact diffused and run into the ground. So if we are going to preach the big foundation field and say to them, here's 8 models for social justice philanthropy, you might want to try this work. Do you really believe that the mainstream philanthropic community is in a position to actually do this work? There is evidence, in fact, and I think over the time we've seen evidence of grassroots movements, efforts at social change that in fact have been compromised, deflected, and deferred as a result of deep entanglements with mainstream institutional philanthropy. So how do we resolve that? If we're going to preach to the broader world, are you sure that this is actually a gospel that would actually advance the field? So that's a strategic question. The second strategic question I have is a little bit more in the way in which this paper is presented. The paper has a lot of language which is philosophical, and some of it is very value-laden, and some of it has a spiritual kind of feel to some level. The question is this the language that the broader philanthropic world understands and would respond to? I would suggest from a strategic point of view, if you want to promote social justice philanthropy, you've got to use a different approach. You've got to change this language from values and norms and justice and redistribution and all these loaded terms into cooler, more technocratic, detached language, because the mainstream philanthropic world is interested in social impact, effectiveness. They're fundamentally oriented towards this question of proof of impact and effectiveness. And there's not much in the paper yet that kind of gets to this question of how this will work and will it make a fundamental difference. And unless you engage this question of effectiveness, impact, proof, you're not talking in the language of the mainstream philanthropic establishment. So if indeed you want to get the social justice conversation out of its little confines into the broader world, I think that there's a problem of getting this language to connect more with the way in which people are thinking and focusing in terms of building philanthropic strategy. So those are some practical and strategic concerns. I also have just a more philosophical concern, which is the paper is very much focused on the world and society and social change. And it doesn't have really much or anything to do with donors or funding. It's all about them, not about the principles of philanthropy. And this is problematic, I think, because in some ways philanthropy is not just about getting things done, not just about getting to social change or social justice. It's not just about getting to certain kind of end result, no matter what the technocratic kind of obsession with effectiveness might lead you to believe. A lot of donors also view philanthropy as fundamentally expressive, that it's an enactment of their values and of their commitments. And yes, they want impact, but they also want to have their values and beliefs reflected in their giving. And so I think the paper needs, and our discussion of social justice philanthropy needs to have a little bit more balance between kind of reflecting on social impact and social justice needs on the one hand, and also this question of how do we motivate donors to give and to engage this challenge of philanthropy. If social justice is put forward as a kind of calling and as a way for philanthropy to move forward, I think it also has to find a way to engage donors. I don't see much of that yet in this conversation. So I'm trying to give constructive critique, which is if in fact you want this to go broader, if you want to open up a conversation about social justice philanthropy, I think you have to answer these practical questions. I think you have to engage the deep strategic question about whether or not this field is really going to take on this work sensibly. And finally, I think you got to get a balance. It's more of a balance between the donor side and the community side for this to work. Because ultimately, philanthropy is driven by, no matter what we want us to believe about social needs. They're important, but philanthropy is ultimately driven by individuals and the institutions that they leave behind. So if you could address practical, strategic, and that kind of one philosophical question between the balance of instrumental and expressive purposes, I think you'd be heading in the right direction. But I thank you, and I'm glad to have had a chance to come. Thanks.
Thank you.
I grew up in the segregated South in the 1960s. I remember my father always, and when I say always, I mean always, having at least 2 jobs. But I also remember the struggles, the hurdles that my father had to overcome just to do basic things like fight against the city to get our street paved, to get the sewer system for the city hooked up to our house and the houses of our Black neighbors. I also remember how he was repeatedly harassed for having the audacity to fight for those basic public improvements that each of the white neighborhoods in the city where I grew up had. Improvements, I might add, that they had in part paid for by the taxes that my father, my mother, and our neighbors paid. I also still have very vivid memories of being stopped by the police on more than one occasion for the crime of being Black and driving a late model luxury car. I remember seeing my brother and my father subjected to that same kind of humiliation, all because the white police officers who stopped us, for them it was a given that if you have Black folks in that day and age in particular driving a nice car and a late model nice car, then clearly the car must be stolen. It couldn't be that they actually owned the vehicle. I share these tidbits of my personal story because they and a multitude of other lived experiences are what have actually informed for me from a very early age what social justice is. I've learned what social justice is by experiencing firsthand what it is not. In order to understand what social justice philanthropy is, we obviously need to start with an understanding of what social justice is. And for me, growing up again as a black woman in the segregated South in the 60s, at its core, social justice is about righting societal wrongs, wrongs that impede people in doing the things that Albert alluded to, wrongs that flow from the statistics that he cited to us. And social justice philanthropy then is about devoting resources, about devoting strategies to figuring out how do we rectify those societal wrongs in ways that actually make a difference in people's lives. Growing up in the South during a time in our nation's history when segregation and mistreatment based upon race was not only an accepted social norm, but was actually the law of the land, I decided at a very young age that I wanted to go to law school. It seemed to me growing up watching the televised debates of legislative hearings about the validity of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it just seemed to me as a child that the people who were making decisions that affected my life, my family's life, and the lives of the people I knew were lawyers. And I wanted to understand this system of the law and how to work from the inside to change the law and the legal structures that defined the quality of life that we enjoyed. One of the things I find particularly interesting about being a trial lawyer, which is my background prior to coming to philanthropy at the Ford Foundation, I was always fascinated by the ideas of juries. I was a big Perry Mason fan as a child, and fascinated by how you can have a group of people who hear the exact same evidence, who see the exact same thing, and yet can come out with different, opposite conclusions. The defendant is guilty. The defendant is not guilty. We heard the same evidence. The plaintiff wins, the plaintiff loses. How does that happen? It's clear to me that one of the reasons that this happens is because we bring to our view of the world, to the things that we hear and we see, the lenses of our personal experiences. They filter how we view things, what my personal lived experience has been, what is my predisposition, what are the things that interest me, what are the things that are assumptions that are embedded in my view of the world, is why we can have juries to look at the exact same thing and come out with different conclusions. And I think of social justice philanthropy as being very, very similar. One of the reasons that there is such a broad spectrum of varied approaches to social justice philanthropy is because different donors, different foundations, by virtue of their institutional cultures and histories, their personal preferences, their interests, their expertise, use different lenses both to define what the societal wrong is that they're trying to change and the methodology and the strategies that they want to use to make those changes. Another reason that there's such a multiplicity of definitions of social justice philanthropy and approaches to how we do social justice philanthropy is because of the sheer complexity of the issues that we're trying to address. Issues of governance and democracy, issues of the environment and sustainability, issues of race, gender, and religious equity, just to name a few. Issues such as these don't lend themselves to the nice, neat little boxes that we tend to want to put them into. The ways in which these issues play out in people's lives don't readily fit within the parameters of our institutions' various initiatives or the way we've organized our institutions and our grant making. By their very nature, the issues that we're tackling are complex, multidimensional, and ever-changing. Their sheer dynamism and intricacy, I believe, requires that we employ a multitude of different strategies and approaches. The piece of social justice philanthropy, the piece of the social justice philanthropy puzzle that I'm committed to focusing on is what I term the healing and upliftment of Black people, to again address some of the statistics that Albert shared with us. Changes in the law to make it illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of race is obviously a very important piece of the puzzle, but it's still just a piece, an important piece, but nevertheless a piece. Changes in the law were, and in some instances remain, necessary, but in and of themselves, changes in the law obviously are not sufficient. For decades now, it's been illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of their race. Yet in this society today, racial discrimination still persists. Political empowerment is another approach that defined social justice during the civil rights movement in my early formative years. When people have taken advantages of changes in the law, though, and voted even in mass numbers, yes, there have been changes. Yes, there have been improvements. We've come a long way both as a people and as a nation, but still inequities persist. So again, political empowerment is necessary, but not sufficient. In a democratic society, political empowerment is how we change the law, how we change public policy, how we change the allocation of public resources. So for me, political empowerment continues to be a foundational pillar of what social justice philanthropy should be about. But my own thinking on this issue has actually evolved over time. I've added two other components to define what social justice social justice philanthropy work means for me. One pillar is what I call social enterprise, and what our reading today characterizes as triple bottom line. Particularly in this economic climate, with soaring double-digit unemployment rates in the Black community, and in some places, rates that are so high that they are double the population at large, where people who actually are fortunate enough to have jobs, who get up and go to work each and every day and work very hard, they still can't earn a living wage to take care of their families. In many Black communities, far too many Black communities today, there's still a prevalence of food deserts, a lack of basic goods and services. In this context, jobs and economic revitalization are paramount needs, obviously, within the Black community. And I believe that the answers and many of the resources to address these pressing needs lie within the Black community itself. And I believe that social enterprise is a part of the answer. To complement the political empowerment and the social enterprise that is the social enterprise aspect of what, for me, currently defines social justice, there's a third pillar that I'm dedicating myself to. It's what I call personal transformation. It's an approach that I don't think is really adequately addressed by either of the 8 approaches that are identified in Albert and Deborah's piece. But as he said, there are many different approaches. Personal transformation, as I define it, is a type of leadership development that consists of 2 elements. One is the diagnosing, acknowledging, and healing of social trauma. It's also helping people to be more effective social change agents. The tendency of social justice philanthropy is more often than not to focus on external factors to the people who we say that we're trying to help, to either change the law or do something to restructure the institutions that are impacting them, to increase the money and resources that are available to them. Clearly, these are all vitally important and very much needed. But we rarely stop to consider what are the internal impacts that people suffer from injustice. There's an increasing body of scientific evidence to support what some within the Black community have always maintained, and that is that structural racism has identifiable negative emotional, psychological, and even physical and spiritual impacts that are passed on from generation to generation and that continue to be exacerbated by current circumstances. Acknowledging, diagnosing, and healing this social trauma is part of the social justice philanthropy work that I deeply believe needs to be done. The second element of personal transformation, as I'm defining it, focuses on the nature of the leadership that is necessary to achieve the desired outcomes that we say we want. Much of the current focus in philanthropy is on impact and metrics, which is obviously a very important consideration. However, we rarely stop to think about what is the nature and the quality of the leadership we need to focus on the programmatic or to achieve the programmatic outcomes that we want. There's an emerging model of leadership development called transformative organizing, which I can explain a little bit about in the Q&A if people are interested. But at its core, what transformative organizing does is to focus on helping people to show up better in their interactions. It helps them to be more centered and grounded so that they can consistently maintain a high level of performance and have a greater impact in the work that they're trying to do. So again, a place where I think I can make a contribution, when I think that there is a huge need within social justice philanthropy, is on the integration of these three pieces: political empowerment, social enterprise, and personal transformation. The enormity of the issues that we are facing, these and others, is such that social justice philanthropy, I would submit, by definition, must take on many approaches and must evolve as issues and circumstances change and evolve. A pivotal question, I think, for the social justice sector is, regardless of how we define social justice philanthropy, at the end of the day, is our work adding up to more than the sum of its parts? Are we working in systemic ways with each other, or with at least a consciousness of what each other is doing, in ways that are discrete pieces of the puzzle, our chosen approaches to social justice philanthropy are righting societal wrongs and actually making a constructive, positive difference in people's lives, resulting in the society that we envision? Frankly, I'm not always so sure that it does. I look forward to hearing what you think.
Want to roll your neck, stretch a little bit. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Stovey, and I work at the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. I'm going to take a little bit of different approach here because I work for a foundation that does not identify as a social justice funder and certainly does not identify as a liberal foundation. And we do not have kind of a mega script of what we think society ought to look like. So as I think as Peter noted, our grant making is informed by the values of our founder, Charles Stewart Mott. And so I'm going to just summarize in one or two sentences one of the ways that we talk about how we understand Mr. Mott's values. So we operate from the perspective that enhancing the capacity of individuals, families, and institutions at the local level and beyond is the highest form of our philanthropy. We do that, we say that we do that, by nurturing strong, self-reliant individuals, by promoting work that preserves fundamental democratic principles and rights, by encouraging citizen participation, by encouraging personal accountability and institutional accountability, by developing leaders, and by respecting diversity. So that's who we say we are. We don't have a mega script about what your life or your community ought to look like, but operating from that value system, we have a set of grant-making strategies that we pursue. Now, how you think about what makes for strong, resilient individuals, families, and communities is going to have implications for the kinds of strategies and tactics that you devise for your grant making. And so, as Thomasina observed for us, the worldview in communities informs what people understand to be about just and fair for themselves, for their families, for their communities, and for their lives. The best way for people to act on their worldview within, again, those values that I just said about Mott, that we're trying to fund, is to listen to people in those communities tell you what they want to do. And so that's the reason that the Mott Foundation funds community organizing as a strategy for enhancing the agency and the accountability of individuals, communities, and institutions throughout the United States. We think that community organizing, sort of in the language of Albert's paper, delivers that triple bottom line of human capital, social capital, and we would say both bonding and bridging social capital, and financial capital. That it delivers real and tangible assets to people on the ground, and that those people can figure out which of, whether it's these 8 kind of philosophical traditions that they are the most interested in pursuing, if it's a rule of law question that they want to address, if it's a shared values question that they want to address, a structural injustice, a political empowerment question that they want to address or some other question that they want to address. And for us, it's by using the methodology of community organizing. Because we invest in community organizing, I think we get confused with being a liberal funder. But that's why I again want to go back to what is the value set that we're operating from. We come to our funding of community organizing not through a set of issues, but through this value of investing in the agency and capacity of individuals, families, communities, and the institutions serving those individuals, families, and communities. And a sort of a sense of a reciprocity of interest and efficacy. We have a definition of what we mean by community organizing, and I'm going to tell you what that is. And I think it's really practical. I think our grant making is very practical. So we say that community organizing is a form of leadership development that enables a constituency to create and sustain an organization that turns its resources into the power to make change. Want me to say it again? Did you want to write it down? A form of leadership development that enables a constituency to create and sustain an organization that turns its resources into the power to make change. So I'm just going to open up each one of those really, really quickly, and then I'll just stop. So leadership. By leadership, we mean taking responsibility for empowering yourself and others to achieve shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. So it's not about positional authority. In organizing, we believe the success of the entire enterprise depends on the attention to developing leaders. A constituency is not a group of people that you represent. It is the people that you stand with together to achieve your common purpose. So it's not like a political constituency. It's the who is my us, that's my constituency. It's important that people build an organization in our model of investing in the capacity of individuals and communities. Associational life is critical to democracy, and I said earlier, democratic practice and principles is one of our value sets. We believe associational life is really critical to democracy. It's critical to the values of democracy, especially a system as complex as the one that we are all trying to navigate. The role of mediating institutions in our society has declined. And so when people build their own organizations that become the mediating institutions between themselves and this complex society in which we live, people can participate at a higher level of empowerment and agency. So rather than just asking them to plug into an organization or a program, they create an organization that designs its own solutions. The organizations that we want to fund, we kind of have three questions. How do people develop as leaders? What effect does the structure of the organization have on agency and hope and creativity? And can it actually turn people's resources into the power to make change? So we think that people have resources. The idea isn't that people come together, they get mobilized, they create a set of demands, and then they create a demand that somebody meets their demands. Rather, they gather their resources with the firm belief that they have at least some of the resources to respond to the problems that they themselves have identified. The basic resources are people, relationships and connections, knowledge and money. So every community has some of those in some measure. They may need more of some of those. They may need more knowledge to figure out what to do about housing. They may need more relationships to figure out what to do about, I don't know, some political question that they have. But they have something. They need to develop the power to move additional additional resources in order to achieve their shared purpose. So the purpose of developing power isn't to exercise power over anyone else, but rather to achieve your shared purpose, your aspirations for your family, yourself, your community, your kids, your life. And so the organization then is the way that people can come together and create the influence to move resources that they need moved in order to enable them to act on their chosen strategies. The purpose of this then is to make a change. A problem's been identified, something's got to change. We think change has to be measurable, clear, specific, and substantial. So it's not enough to say that the organization held a bunch of meetings and we developed really better relationships. That's a change, you know, maybe in my life, in your life, it's an important underpinning of the kind of change we're looking for. But poor people and working class people already have plenty of experience on how to lose. There's no point building an organization if you can't win on something that your family and your community needs and wants. In organizing, then, people are actors. They are not beneficiaries. They are citizens. They are not clients. So our approach, then, to what might be called social justice philanthropy is an approach of listening. It's an approach of responding through a strategy of helping people build organizations, and I just gave you all the characteristics of those organizations, assuming that people already have some of what they need, and that with a little bit of philanthropic investment, they can organize to get more of what they need in order to achieve the purposes for which they've come together. For that reason, we invest in organizations that operate at the local level, but have relationships at a state, regional, or national level. So we don't invest, for example, in unaffiliated organizing. We invest in only organizing that is somehow networked, so that learning across communities and across this country can take place in a really rational manner. That informs not only people and communities, but it informs us in philanthropy, we think. I, at the end of the day, am a rather a kind of a pathetic, starry-eyed believer in America and American democracy. I mean, I just really am. I cannot be convinced to see my future otherwise. I don't think that community organizing is going to save American democracy, but I don't think we're going to save it without it. So I'm really privileged to be in the position that I'm in investing in this approach to what some people, but not the Mott Foundation, would call social justice philanthropy.
Thank you all very much. One thing, and I'll just throw out a couple of questions, and then we'll turn to the audience for Q&A. One thing, Ms. Dobie, that you mentioned, it was kind of a telling phrase. You don't have a preconceived notion of the sort of society you want to encourage.
Well, I meant to say we don't have like a script of what you ought to look like.
Right, exactly. And it occurs to me that sort of goes to Peter's point about a possible tension among these 8 categories. The Mott commitment to community organizing, more or less said, it's somewhat agnostic about the notion of the society that you will have at the end of the process of organizing. Whereas some of the categories that Albert's topology includes, some of those categories are pretty specific about the kind of society you're going to have at the end of this process. So going to Peter's question about a possible contradiction or a possible tension among these approaches. In other words, they don't. To some extent, as Peter suggests, they're complementary. You can choose among from the menu and pursue different approaches. But sometimes, like this one, the community organizing might not, in fact, result in a vision of social justice that's included in some of these other categories. Can you sort of say something about that, and other panelists please join in as well?
Sure, I think that's a fair criticism. These 8 categories when you talk about the practices of social justice grant makers or any grant makers, they're used in combinations. You will find a grant maker start out talking about human rights and then shift to talking about empowerment, depending on the audience. They're used in different contexts for different reasons. You're right, there are some that are fairly normative. I think perhaps the one normative vision that unites them all is that there's a kind of Star Trek world at the end of it all. There's a fair world where people have meaningful work, where they have access to quality health care, where their kids have a world-class education. It's a Star Trek world minus the intergalactic warfare. And that's a vision pretty much shared by everyone. Nobody wants to live in war. Nobody wants to be hungry. These are very, very basic things. So if there's one normative vision, I suppose that would be it. But you're right, how you go about it, whether it's a kind of what I would call community empowerment model that Chris is talking about, or whether you are entirely about the looking at current laws and making sure that they're enforced, or whether you're about looking at structural injustice, that's entirely up to the grant maker. It changes again from context to context across the world. This is a kind of global typology in the sense that we interviewed people who self-identify as social justice grant makers from all over the world, and that's what the typology was based on. And we agree that there are, tensions. Not all use all of these types of social justice grant making. Some will use some won't. But yes, there is a tension.
And one other question. You mentioned at the outset that this project was undertaken with some sense of frustration about the way what you described as liberal philanthropy operated. And I'm just curious, what does that mean? What does that mean? In other words, for some folks, there wouldn't be a difference between liberal philanthropy and social justice philanthropy. How are you? What's the, what is that distinction that you were fretting?
Right. Well, the talking about liberal philanthropy wasn't even in the paper. I just added it today. Because,
no, it was a terrific point.
The social justice philanthropy, and it's not everybody who's in this field who has the same kinds of critiques of the way philanthropy or regular or mainstream philanthropy is practiced. I have, a number of issues with the way it's practiced. I don't think, for example, that we talk enough with one another when we're working in a particular part of the world, let's say New Orleans, my hometown, where you can have national funders trying to do good there and yet not always coordinating what it is that they're doing in a particular area. That's one critique. There's a critique that has to do with the degree to which grant makers involve or fail to involve in a meaningful way the communities that they're trying to affect. And this is, I think, a point that Christine was making very well, where the involvement is pretty thin in some cases, and where the grant maker's not taking his or her cues from the communities. So that's another critique. And there are other areas that are implied by some of these traditions, but might not be implied by others.
Okay. And Thomasina, right at the end of your presentation, you mentioned that you sort of ended on a note of skepticism about social justice philanthropy's ability, I think, to embrace what you were describing as the transformational aspect of your understanding of social justice philanthropy. Could you say just a bit more about that?
Yes, I wasn't really speaking to the issue of personal transformation in particular. I agree with many of the critiques that Albert has shared. I think one of the challenges is justice by definition is a very subjective thing. What is fair to me might not be fair to you. And so we have to be comfortable, I think, with that ambiguity. But at the same time, I think one of the ways that we can be more effective than we are in philanthropy It just boggles my mind sometimes, the hundreds of millions of dollars that are poured at particular issues. But if we're not doing it with a vision of where we're trying to get, if we are working in isolation from each other, if we are working at odds with each other, sometimes tension is healthy. And sometimes you may want to try what might appear to be contradictory approaches, but it's important, I think, to be cognizant of that when you're doing it. So for me, it's not always a question of funders having to work together lockstep, but as Albert was suggesting, at least being in communication so you understand what each other is doing, and that again, hopefully, the sum is the whole is adding up to more than the sum of the parts. For me, I don't know that the whole does add up to more than the sum of the parts. I think if it did, then we would have made a lot more progress than we have made on a number of issues. I think that there is great potential for us to make more effective use of not just the dollars, but also people resources expertise that existed if the sector itself, Peter was talking about how the paper was sort of turned outward. I think that's how, in my experience, philanthropy tends to operate. That we will, for example, want to encourage our grantees to work together, to collaborate, to be in communication, in conversation, when we're not doing that ourselves. And so that's where my skepticism comes from. But I, like Chris, I'm an eternal optimist. We are making progress. But we could be making so much more progress, in my opinion, if we thought differently about the way in which we do our work and what is it that we're actually trying to achieve at the end of the day.
Yeah.
If I could just add a little bit there. So this is what I think that happens in philanthropy. Many large, small, medium philanthropies, family philanthropies, donors, they do, as Peter said, they operate from their value system. And often there's an issue they want to work on. And they really want that issue to resonate with and even to sometimes be driven by the community. But they get frustrated. And I think this is where, like in a place like New Orleans or any other sort of place-making kind of grant-making strategy, you have funders who have an issue that they want to work on. And they want people to work on it. They want some grantee to work on it. And then they have these community-based organizations that are developing leaders, empowering leaders, and often that's where the clash is. I mean, the funder says, well, but I would fund that group, but they're not working on my issue. Well, what if your issue isn't the right issue? Well, of course my issue is the right issue.
Always.
I mean, how could that even be a question? Not only is my issue the right issue, my issue is the most important issue. And they're not working on the most important issue. And so I think it's even worse than just sometimes miscommunication or a clash. It's that not only is it my issue, and obviously the most important issue, or I wouldn't be spending all this money on it, since they aren't working on it, I'm going to create a new organization that will. So, I can get a little frustrated although I'm pretty optimistic and I love my colleagues in philanthropy, I can get a little frustrated by that approach. If we turn that around and listen to people a little bit more, we might find out that we do have really the right, most important issue, but maybe today's not the day to work on it.
Yeah, but Peter would say, right, that's absolutely the donor's prerogative, and to heck with these community groups, right?
I might put it slightly differently, but I'd like to see a balance between the donor's prerogative and the community's. But there's kind of a disconnect here, because on the one hand, you're talking about this world in which these people are going to rise up, they're going to take charge of their lives, they're going to drive change, they're going to stick it to the man, and then they put on their little Talbot's dresses and they come into the office and they ask for grants very politely in the areas that they think you want. And so I tend to think that that's why I spoke about this question of, is institutional philanthropy really ready to do this sort of work? Because a lot of the operating principles, a lot of the ethos, a lot of the systems are not set up to say, I'm wrong, you're right, run with the ball and I'll see you in 3 years. That's not how mainstream philanthropy works. But if you take seriously this idea of empowerment, human transformation, all these big concepts that involve delegating a lot of authority to people and letting them construct their vision of the good and run with it, there's a problem there, because that's not the way mainstream philanthropy operates. And there's just a tiny little insignificant sliver of the philanthropic world that is attuned to these issues. It doesn't represent.
I think we all agree with that.
Well, I'm just saying, but you know, there are these progressive funders, there's the alternative funds, there's a small group that try to reverse the grant making process and empower people to kind of the community to make the decisions. There's a small group, but by and large, if you look across 60,000 foundations, all the individual donors, they're not thinking in these terms. They're not.
I agree. I think you're absolutely right.
So
I think that's part of the critique.
And that's part of your...
That the sector
Yeah.
needs to do some work internally. I'm a big believer in focusing on the internal and preparing to deal with the external, and I don't think that the sector does enough of that.
So that actually, I mean, Albert, that suggests not just 8 sort of different views of social justice, but really a fundamental transformation in the way philanthropy does its business. I mean, would you go so far as to say that the alternative funds approach, which, as Peter pointed out, hasn't exactly picked up a lot of steam. Is something like that needed in order to?
Very much so. Interestingly, the original paper had a part 2, and the part 2 is very normative, and it had a very strong normative element that we decided to take out. The reason we took it out was we thought the first job, or the primary job of this paper, was to cut through a lot of the lack of clarity about what social justice philanthropy is. There are a lot of people who tried to define it very precisely. And the approach we took was a very big tent approach. And we said, look, there are so many ways of doing this and so many traditions. And just be aware, for example, if you're working in the human rights tradition, that this is a very old tradition. And as we put it in the paper, just about every thrust and parry in the human rights tradition and the arguments for and against has been tried. And you could learn from this. The notion of a human right is problematic. And you should be aware of this if you are going to make your argument for social justice in that tradition. And that's really all the paper tried to do. It was very descriptive. The normative part of the paper we published separately, and it really lays out do's and don'ts. And it includes things like how you should engage the community, where you're leading from, what kind of values you bring to your grant making, and various other things that Peter and Thomasina and Christine have alluded to.
So there was a part 2, and we didn't include that in the required reading. So you all are going to go back.
Homework.
We'll link to that in the script, and you all will have to go back and read part 2. I didn't realize.
We didn't. We presented it to one group that did everything short of setting it on fire. So yeah.
Excellent. That's our kind of paper.
There we go.
Yeah, good, terrific. All right, well, we have a terrific audience here, and we'll go to Q&A. A couple of things. When you, A, wait for the microphone. B, speak directly into the microphone. You really have to hold the thing right up to your mouth. Identify yourself, please. And please, questions only. No, I mean, of course, comments are welcome, but brief comments. Leading to something like a question.
Or Bill, the way we do it now is it's a long statement followed by "I'm right, am I not?"
Oh, I'm right, am I not? Yes. Well, we get a lot of those, and so we're going to try to avoid that here today. Please, yes.
My name is Ruth Lubick. I'm a nurse midwife and running a project here in the district in Ward 5, where we've been able to reduce the disparities suffered by the African American families there significantly. But we have a big problem. First of all, she's only a nurse, you know. Secondly, she's only a woman. But thirdly, can you tell me what effect the building of projects on demonstration rather than on research might have in the way of philanthropic gifts?
Is that directed at me? You're looking
to all of you. Yeah.
Could you clarify just in other words? Is it better to have a project on the ground underway rather than doing research, or what is the?
Well, these positive outcomes that we've had,
Right.
we're criticized because we have not done a randomized controlled trial.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
terrific.
we went in
Right,
and
right.
based
Yes.
on our human values
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
our knowledge of women and families, and set up something that we thought would be meaningful to them, and
Right.
indeed it has been. But I'm hard pressed, for example, in front of a Surgeon General's meeting about the infant mortality in the District of Columbia. A big panel of researchers said, well, we just have to study them more. And,
Right.
you know, they were talking about the African Americans, of course. They have the largest infant mortality. But I, at that point, grabbed a microphone, as I have done today, and said, you cannot go into a low-income area and treat people like research subjects.
Excellent. Good.
And so I was wondering how much the philanthropists how much stock they put into, have they done a randomized controlled trial, or are they in there with their hearts trying to help people that need help?
Good. Thank you. Yes. Excellent question.
It obviously depends. I think there are as many approaches and criteria for what people are looking for in making grants as there are the different approaches to social justice philanthropy. You know, as you were talking, something that came to mind for me is this Chinese proverb that says, those who say it cannot be done should get out of the way of those who are doing it. And I would suggest to you that there are funders out there, I would think, who would be interested in the fact that you actually have made a difference in people's lives, irrespective of whether you start with a randomized controlled group. And so you have to keep looking for who are those funders. Where can I find those people, and not worry about the people who want randomized controlled groups.
But it goes to this tension, I think, of the methods of the funders and the mindsets of the social change actors, because the idea of you going out and paying some university to conduct some in-depth multi-year trial would, I think, it would be very hard. It's very expensive. It's extremely hard to do. And then the outcomes you may be after, particularly if there's something like human transformation or empowerment, what are those outcomes, and how do we measure those? Those are much harder than some of the more concrete health or educational outcomes that we typically might measure. So the social justice approach has, I think, inherent in it very complex outcomes that don't lend themselves as well as some of the more basic service outcomes to measurement. And that puts it at some kind of odds with at least a part of the philanthropic establishment that's profoundly interested in measurement, impact, and proof.
Ruth, I know your project. When I was at the, was it the birthing project, or you had a midwife project, didn't you? Yeah.
Fathers groups and teen groups and so forth. And then there's also early childhood education. And I have to say to those people here who are educators, if you want to change education, you get the mother in pregnancy. You don't wait until she's effecting on her children what has been affected on her in the past, which hasn't really worked. And now I'll shut up.
I can't speak for all foundations, but I know that when I was here 3 years ago at the Meyer Foundation, we funded your group because of you. We were betting on good leaders, on people who had a vision about what needed to be done and who were doing it, and it had nothing to do with metrics. We thought that the measurements would come later.
Well, my measurement, my latest measurement is that I turned 85 last week.
Well, congratulations.
Happy birthday.
Yes, please, Mr. Ottinger.
Hello, thank you all. My name is Larry Ottinger. I'm president of the Center for Lobbying in the Public Interest. I want to first say that I do think there's something normative that at least 3 of the 4, I'm not sure if it's a clean sweep, believe in, which is people being engaged in their communities and in the lives of their communities and governance issues that affect them. My question is about the metrics following up, and it may have been in the homework that I missed, and I apologize, teacher, if that's true.
Quiet
But
reading.
the Foundation Center, how do we measure, given that there are different definitions of social justice philanthropy? I do think it's important to be able to have some measurement, even if it's imperfect and the data isn't great. And how do we? The Foundation Center has measured based on a certain number of foundations and types of grants, somewhere around 12%, and it's gone maybe at 15% now of total private and community foundation grant making that goes to what they've defined based, I think, on an NCCRP definition of social justice philanthropy. What do you all think of that, and how should we measure progress towards at least several of the panelists said we need more? So how do you benchmark that?
Well, I can attempt to answer that. I saw the Foundation Center report that you're talking about. They've had two now, actually. And the definition that they gave, I forget what its elements were, but it was something about trying to change the structural conditions that keep people in poverty, but it was one of these structural definitions. And I think the reason they, I'm not sure, it may have originated with the NCRP, which is the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. There might be somebody in the room who's with that organization. But I think they
Pretty
chose...
much the whole staff is here.
Oh, okay. But the reason the Foundation Center chose that definition was so that they could return to the survey year after year, and even though it's an imperfect definition, at least against that definition, they would be able to see how many people self-identified as social justice grant makers. But I think if you look at a lot of the examples that are given in that particular publication, I have to squint pretty hard to really see social justice grant making in it. I don't think making a grant just to an advocacy organization really puts you necessarily in the social justice camp. I think a lot more has to go into it, but that's a matter of discussion and debate.
I totally agree with that the category is extremely hard to set up, because a big function has to be the intention of the grant maker, not just is a particular community service engaged in an attempt to create better conditions, but is the grant maker engaging in this activity because they're committed to social justice. That's a piece of it, and then it has to be what's actually going on. Is it different than any other kind of service or advocacy work? It has to have a different feel, and it's very hard to get that nailed down across a large number of grants. So I would treat that data with some care.
And I would just say that, I mean, for me, at the end of the day, the bottom line is, are we making a positive difference in people's lives? We can change a structure and it still not change people's lives. So to me, changing the structure in and of itself is not sufficient. I think one of the challenges with the issues that we try to deal with and address in social justice philanthropy is that there's a long time horizon. And social justice philanthropists, philanthropy in general, don't usually stick with anything, frankly, long enough to have the kind of systemic impact that we're trying to get, that the conditions that we're dealing with are long-standing, systemic, deep-rooted, evolving, changing. The complexity of it requires a longer time horizon, I think, to even start talking about, are we making a difference, are we making an impact in people's lives? And so I think it does have to be more of an individualized approach as to what exactly is this particular funder trying to do. I also think that there is a lot of value in understanding more the interconnectedness of our different issues. I mean, as Chris was talking about, people tend to think that my issue is the issue, this is the way, the only way. Well, there is no one answer. There is no holy grail here. The reality is that different issues intersect, intertwine, interrelate, and I think we need to have more of a consciousness of where does our little piece fit in the larger puzzle. And it may be that I think those kinds of considerations have to be taken into account when we're talking about metrics. It's not as empirical sort of, widgets. We cranked out 3 bolts in 2 hours and 13 seconds and involved 20 pieces of equipment. Social justice, transformation, social change just doesn't lend itself to that. And I think we have to be comfortable with that. I think we also have to be comfortable with the fact that there are no ready answers, and we have to be willing to take risks. And taking risk and trying new things means that some things aren't necessarily going to work out the way you thought they would, but you learn something from that and then you move on. So I would just argue for changing people's lives, something tangible, and a longer time horizon.
Bill, you might actually be a social justice funder in the sense you provided lunch to several NCRP members. And this could be viewed as capacity building.
Excellent, capacity building.
And
Yes,
so that's part of the right. You have to put some boundaries on this, and they have to be real. That's the point. I mean,
right, yeah, and that raises this interesting question, Chris. Why is Mott? I mean, you the first thing you said was Mott is not a social justice.
We don't identify that.
Right, you don't. Why not? And I mean, I don't know whether then you are or are not counted in the foundation center's, social justice grant making. But it's just I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
I just work there.
Okay, I take that back. No, I just.
We are a value-driven foundation, and so I tried to lay out those values. But we just do not self-identify as a social justice funder or as a liberal funder.
Gotcha.
We're trying to make grants along this value line.
Yeah, sure. Yep, good. No, just like the Hudson Institute is a strictly nonpartisan operation.
So I hear.
Yes. Right. Yes, please. Right. Go ahead.
I work on the Hill for a nonprofit called the Faith and Politics Institute. We're bipartisan. We work with members of Congress and their staff. We do a civil rights pilgrimage to Alabama, Selma, Tuskegee, Birmingham. And I also run the Low Dollar Donors Program, which is donors under $1,000, grassroots individual supporters. So what I'm trying to sell to the individual donor is helping our leaders, helping Congress understand the civil rights history, the trail, how far we've come, how far we still have to go, is incredibly important. As y'all can understand, that average individual person, the political activist like myself, isn't exactly sold on helping Congress is the exact best way to go. But I am convinced if we can help our leaders, understand history and their staff, that we can, make progress and have social change as well as bipartisan compromise. So I'd be interested in any advice from the panel on tactics to talk to individuals about both large and small donations to a nonprofit with a mission similar to mine.
This is a question to how to help individuals, specifically to give to an organization that's working to influence congressional members?
Yes.
That's a tough sell, you're right.
I've been working on it for 5 months,
Well, I think the way to deal with politicians is obviously through their constituencies. And so to the extent that you're trying to work with people who are registered voters and actually cast their ballots in the places where those elected officials are the places they're representing, then that's obviously, I think, a more direct approach. But it is a tough sell because there is such cynicism about Congress. I mean, I think one of the challenges, different subject, is when you said something to the effect of helping our leaders to be educated on these issues. I think part of the work, at least for me, around social justice philanthropy, and it sounds like very much also for Mott, is to help people see themselves as leaders and not just look to elected representatives.
Yes, Sue. I knew when the issue of measurement and social justice came up, that had Sue Hochstetter written all over it. So
I knew you were thinking that, but surprisingly, I'm not going to talk about it.
You're not going to talk about it.
I'm Sue Hochstetter with the Alliance for Justice, and we provide training and technical assistance on advocacy, including advocacy and community organizing evaluation. It seems to me that there was agreement on the panel that mainstream philanthropy needs to take community input more into advising their grant making. I'm right, am I not?
You are wrong.
Except for Pete.
I'm saying I don't think they are very open to it. It's hard for the field to do it. That's my position.
Well, that really does relate to my question. It seems that people thought that would be a good thing, and my question was going to be, how can we make that happen?
Yeah, good. Peter has an easy answer. It ain't going to happen, so don't even try.
It's very, it just is so hard to. I mean, that's a question that's been asked for 40 years around the philanthropy field, which is how do we break through these resource-independent islands of privilege and power to get them to listen and act in a way that's more connected to the community. That's the quest I think is somewhat quixotic just by the structure and institutional setup of these big institutions. That's not what they're designed to do. And so I don't, that's why I gave you a little bit of a pushback. So I'm not sure that that's what the field is set up to do ultimately. It's set up to grind out grant decisions by and large that are defensible, logical, technically correct. That's what it's set up to do. It has a very fine, educated staff across these large institutions. They do that work well. It's just very hard to then say. That's why I asked you, for whom is this written? So maybe you could answer that, Albert, right now, because they're not, the people working in these big foundations, they're not going to read this and say, you know what, everything I've done in my profession for the last 20 years is wrong. Let's take it to the street.
I can answer on behalf of our foundation, which is a fairly small community foundation. So this is not a large national foundation. But when I started working 3 years ago at the Greater New Orleans Foundation, we had very little by way of community input. And the way that we've tried to do it several ways. The first thing we did was to look at what other foundations do. And what we discovered was that getting real resident input, meaningful resident input, and I'm not talking about just the input of professional advocates, which we call the grass tops, not the grassroots, but to get tenants and other people to chime in is a very expensive thing to do. The best model that I saw, and I asked, there's an affinity group called, I think, Grassroots Grantmakers or something along those lines. And the best model I saw required actually having a staff member completely devoted to that purpose, working essentially 40 hours a week on that, setting up house parties, trying to get, using community-based organizations to get actually into the homes of people who would invite their neighbors. So you could have more of a grassroots input. We can't afford to do that. We hope to be able to afford to do that at some point. Right now, we rely on the grass tops, the people who represent, who are community-based organizations, who listen to their constituents, to get that kind of input. We convene our grantees to several times a year actually, to tell us what we're doing wrong and how we can improve. We have a website that is based very much on a kind of blog model where you can comment. We put down our rationales for why it is what we do, and we invite criticism about why it is what we do, and we act on and we respond to that criticism. And so there are various mechanisms that you can use, but really getting into or deep into communities. And then even then, knowing that what you've heard is at all representative of the community, whatever on earth that is, as a whole is a very, very difficult thing to do.
But Chris, you would say that's sort of what you do, right, at MOD, is to incorporate.
Yeah, I think Peter's right. I think it's a design question, and it's an institutional cultural question. Mm-hmm. And if the leadership of a philanthropic institution wants the inclusion of kind of some competing perspectives as being essential to its success, then it is just a design question. And then you design which influences you want, and you work with your staff to get those. So I would say generally where I work, we have an affirmative an affirmative communications feedback loop with our grantees and with others. So whatever the program area is, it's our culture, it's a design question of the institution to have listening and responding to what you're hearing built in. I want to say though to the question of community input, Sue, and anyone else, like the idea here for me is not to like poll everyone who lives in a community or set up some kind of like Twitter feed and vote on issues. I mean, I think there is a role for mediating institutions who then are representative of people in community to bridge this complicated set of relationships between the citizens who live there and all the different institutions, government, private businesses, nonprofit organizations, philanthropic organizations. So I think I would posit it's completely appropriate to get your feedback from organizations and whoever those organizations have chosen to represent the membership. The problem is, or a challenge is, how democratically governed are those organizations? So that's a question about who you listen to and making sure you're getting some competing perspectives in the room. And then can I just take a quick second? You know, Albert, I just hate that phrase, grass tops. I just hate it. I got to tell you, I spend, you know, because okay, I don't do grass. So I spend $40 a week paying somebody to make sure that the grassroots grow and that they are fertilized and they are stable. And I pay somebody else $35 a week to get rid of the grass tops. So there's something wrong. I don't know, maybe we need a different analogy, but there's just something wrong with that. The idea of the grassroots isn't people that are poor. It's people who are living in communities, and that's their perspective. And they know that housing policy is education policy, is transportation policy, is workforce policy. They know it's all one thing. So often from nonprofit organizations or philanthropy, you know, we're siloed in our issue. Like, they're a housing funder, they're a transportation funder, they're a sprawl funder, they're an education funder. Grassroots people know it's like, you know, the fertilizer has to fall on all this grass. I don't just want the one little green patch and the rest of it brown. So I just think there's a little challenge there in thinking through our analogy, and I'll stop now. I'll get off my soapbox.
And just a quick quote on that. The amazing thing is a lot of foundations listen to the community, but then they do what the heck they want to do anyway. And that's more often the case than not, I would say.
Yeah,
Which I think raises another question. I mean, I agree with Chris that it's a question of institutional design when you're talking about an individual funder. But for the sector, I think it's more of a cultural issue. And so I think what needs to happen is you need to do organizing within the sector. I mean, at Ford spent a lot of time, both internally within the organization and within my particular part of the sector, which was around political engagement issues, organizing, talking with, trying to persuade other funders to see things my way. So I think it really takes a concerted, long-term effort. It's difficult, yes. It's challenging, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, but it has to be part of the work in order to really, I think, broaden the pie so that you do have more people in institutions who are willing to take that lead. I find that there are individuals within institutions. Oftentimes, unfortunately, those individuals are not in decision-making power, but it requires a whole nother set of strategies, I think, at the sectoral level.
That's a good point. Is that... Yes, Kevin, are you raising your hand? Oh, good. I want to hear from NCRP.
Hi, Kevin Laskowski. I'm a Research and Policy Associate at the Vilified National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. So, I sympathize with a lot of the skepticism about whether or not philanthropy is built for this. What about philanthropy renews your faith besides this has to be done and should be done, that it could do more social justice philanthropy, those of you who think it should and can, what renews your faith that this is even a possibility for a sector that, as Professor Frumpkin puts it, is built to grind out defensible technocratic grants?
Yes, those of you who have democratic faiths, let's hear it.
What renews my faith, frankly, is the fact that there are individuals, people who, like my colleague here, Chris, who are in these institutions who are committed to making that difference, to making that change. I mean, there's clearly a need, and as long as there are resources available and there's some way to access some of those resources or try to influence people who have those resources, to me, it's worth making that effort. Otherwise, I should be doing something else.
What renews my faith is a faith in philanthropic jujitsu, which is essentially using the field's current obsession with measurement and effectiveness to call it to account for its outcomes. Because there are many grant makers who want to end poverty or who want to address affordable housing. And if they really took that seriously and they look at how well they were doing, they would see that they weren't doing terribly well. And I would argue that one of the reasons they're not doing terribly well is because they're not looking at the social justice dimensions of the issue that they're trying to address.
Anybody else?
And I think just the only thing I would add to that is, as I move in around philanthropic affinity groups and talk to my colleagues, what really renews my faith is just an increased desire for what is, the shorthand word is public will. But whether it's trying to re-energize democracy, revitalize American democracy, whatever the issue is, there's just an increased and ever-increasing conversation about the absolute value and necessity of a deeper, more meaningful, and engaged public. So that really renews my faith. I think more grant makers will be moving into different ways of trying to do that.
But Peter, you would continue to say...
I have no faith.
You have no faith. So you get to opt out of all these.
Just say no.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, please, write down. Yes, good. Here comes the microphone.
Thanks. My name is Susanna Shapiro, and I serve on the board of a philanthropic network called Grantmakers Without Borders. And we work with approximately 160, some would call it progressive grant makers, and we have annual conferences. And we have been really interested in this issue of, we don't also define, we say social change grant making for the very same reason that it's a sensitive topic. And I'll just say for many of our members, justice, they don't want to talk about justice, and their top donors would just like leave. So we have to kind of frame it in a way, but it's the same thing. So I guess from a GWAB perspective, you'd be right on point, right? Now, my question is, I was totally inspired by this panel and to see how many people here in DC are interested in this topic. We work mostly with global givers. They have to give across borders. Something that sort of totally disturbed me, and I had to make a comment about it, is when Peter mentioned all of his things. I was like, great point, good critique. But when you said that we should begin to embrace the language of mainstream philanthropy, it really bothered me because I feel like there is the problem of being very confrontational, and I worked many times with social movements, and so I always use this like oppressor language. It's not very palatable. I had to leave like several organizations because of that. But but the key is, I think that we have to recognize there's a third option, and that would be to really begin to create and co-create with our grantees a common language for this new movement within philanthropy. So, for example, translocal organizing, some of the work we're doing, some of the work our members are doing, or the community organizing sector. So instead of saying, oh, poor people unite, and that's the real people, we have to just fund them, they know everything. It's about whoever's committed to these social justice goals, whether they have money, whether they don't, whether they have knowledge. It's like you have to work as a sector. So I think kind of bridging this dichotomy is the biggest hope, and I wanted to hear if any of you have kind of begun to think about this new common language, which I think the Ruesga paper begins to really think of a framework about that. So
yeah, great question. And in fact, why don't we make it our last question, and your comments would be your final comments. And let me just build on it for a second. In other words, at the end of the day, right, we continue to have, we go back to Albert's initial point of departure, which is liberal, there has to be some difference between social justice philanthropy and just plain old liberal mainstream philanthropy. And yet when you set out to describe social justice philanthropy, you end up with this problem that the language is frightening to a lot of funders who are doing mainstream funding. So is there a third language that we can use that will somehow, manage to lure over out of liberal, just plain old liberal philanthropy to lure some of those foundations into, I mean, will we get to the point where Mott will actually self-identify as a social, or is
Stop
that?
picking on me.
Sorry. I was told, listen, you're a fellow Michigander, you can take it, you know. If you're from Michigan, you know,
We
you
can
can take
take a
anything.
lot, that's
exactly,
right.
exactly. Thank you.
And have taken
We
a
have
lot.
thick skin these days.
Yes, yes. So, please. And
I
Peter,
think
you
it
don't get to
sounds a
sit
little,
this
you know,
out.
I think that there is a language is emerging and developing. It feels like creepy messaging to say, you know, could we get like a little focus group and get new language so that we're like fooling people? And I know that's not what you mean, and I don't want to participate in that. But I think there is a language developing, but I also think there is a language in social science. There is there is language in sociology that we don't use and that we could adopt. I really think that at Mott we've done a lot with our colleagues to talk about the kind of funding that we do by talking about sociological constructs like human capital, bridging and bonding social capital, delivering financial capital. So I think there is, you know, we could do better with our language, but I don't want to do any creepy messaging.
Good.
That's
Can
appreciated.
someone want to speak up for creepy messenger? This is, no? But answers to the question, are there ways of developing, what is the prospect of accomplishing what she has in?
You go.
Go ahead.
Even though our foundation is in New Orleans, which is a little island of blue and a sea of red, I still have a very conservative board, and I think most boards, actually, pretty much anywhere, are conservative. And I think that the way you do it is you stick to the truth. You speak the truth, and you appeal to the best in other people, and assume that they're on the side of the angels, and you assume that they share your sense of fairness, and you avoid. I think you should avoid language that is very much linked to a particular time and place where people are shaking their fists, and assume that there are people in the business community, people in government, and others who are willing to partner with you. And that's been very effective for us. And I think that really one of the most effective social justice programs that we've had in Louisiana was started by a board member who was a member of the Republican Party for many years, a close friend of Ronald Reagan, was in the oil and gas industry. And now this program is essentially guaranteeing a college education to every graduate, high school graduate who has a B- or I think maybe even a C+ or better grade out of high school. And this program has been replicated in 21 states, and it's extraordinary. I think that's one of the best social justice programs that you can talk about. So expect the unexpected when you open your heart and your language in that way, I would say.
I think it's interesting that in your group of 8 frame, you actually have some that are, I would describe as not as possibly frightening to the mainstream establishment. Structural injustice. Whoa. Redistribution. Not my money. Cultural relativism. It's all the same, man. Those seem harsh or having an edge to them. But other things in your list are softer. Empowerment. Empowerment actually works both sides of the aisle, interestingly. There's a lot of people on both sides that love the idea of empowerment because it has this double meaning of both giving people the ability to solve their own problems, but also, hey, not depending on a handout. And you also have shared values. Who could be against shared values? So I think in the list, there's language there that has a bit of an edge to it, and there's also language there that has a softer contour. I don't think it's sinister to say you got to start thinking about when and how to use this language effectively, because I do believe that the foundation field will, in a sense, to tune you out if you come in with the wrong. My little boy has a Kindle, which his grandmother gave him to my great objection. But now, and we're working on taking it away from him, but it's very hard. But now, if he hears something he doesn't like, he puts on the headphones, plugs in the Kindle, and says, "Can't hear you." That's the foundation rule. If you go in the wrong way, they won't hear. They tune you out. So you got to be sensitive to that.
Yeah, I was struck in Chris's comments the notion of mediating structures. Of course, I was at AEI in the mid '70s when mediating structures was all the rage with Peter Berger, Richard John Newhouse. It was a very it's a concept that can draw people together across ideological boundaries. Thomasina, any last comments before we?
I would just say that while a common language might be helpful, I think you would have to add to that a common meaning for the words that you're using. Because I think there are terms that we use now, like social justice, philanthropy, that people use the same words but have very different meaning for them. And at the end of the day, you know, my personal preference or focus is not to be so much concerned about whether Mott characterizes itself as a social justice philanthropist or philanthropy funder, but what is it actually doing? What impact is it having in the world? And I don't know that, just like we can't agree on a definition of social justice philanthropy, I don't know that we're going to agree on a common language or even a meaning for the terms. So from my perspective, it's like, why would I exert that effort? Why not put that energy into actually trying to make the difference that I want my social justice philanthropy to serve, however I define it?
Very good. Well, let's thank our panel for a terrific conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
And
That was nice. That was a good
at least for 2
remark.
hours,
You
I
did
was
that really
going
well.
to pull you away from the
Thank you. You did a
root
great
causes,
job.
questions.